Welcome to another journey through time, where we explore the paths history might have taken and the lives that might have been lived. Tonight we invite you to settle into comfort, to let your breathing slow and deepen, as we transport you to a world both magnificent and terrible, the heart of the Aztec Empire, where gods walked among mortals, and the line between divine truth and human deception grew thinner with each passing day. Before we delve into another alternate reality, make sure to subscribe and support the channel to motivate us into making more epic stories that lull you straight to sleep. Imagine yourself not as a subject of history, but as one of its most powerful and tormented figures. Picture a life where thousands kneel before you in reverence, where your every word is treated as sacred prophecy, and where the weight of an empire rests upon shoulders that know with crushing certainty that much of what sustains your world is built upon carefully maintained lies. Tonight we explore what it might have been like to be born into the role of a god-king in the great city of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, where the boundaries between the mortal and divine were not just blurred, but deliberately obscured by those who understood that power often requires the most beautiful and terrible of deceptions. Close your eyes, and let us begin this journey into a world where being worshipped as a god was not a blessing, but perhaps the most isolating burden any human being could bear. The first rays of dawn filter through the obsidian-laid windows of your chamber, high atop the great pyramid that dominates Tenochtitlan's skyline. You wake not to the gentle stirring of natural sleep, but to the soft chanting of priests who have been maintaining vigil outside your door since the darkest hour before dawn. Even in your most private moments, you are never truly alone, for gods, they believe, do not require the same solitudes as mortals. Your body aches as you rise from your bed of jaguar pelts and cotton stuffed with the finest down from tropical birds. The ache is entirely human, entirely mortal, but it is a truth you can share with no one outside your most trusted inner circle. To the thousands who serve in your palace, to the millions who populate your empire, you are Huitzilopochtli, pockly made flesh, the hummingbird god reborn in human form to guide the chosen people through another cycle of cosmic time. The morning ritual begins, as it always does, with your body servants approaching on their knees, eyes cast downward, never daring to look directly upon your face. They speak in whispers, their voices carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for prayer. But you know something they do not, or rather, you know something that most of them do not. Among your closest attendants, among the highest priests and your own blood relatives, there exists a different kind of knowledge, a shared understanding that the divine performance you maintain is exactly that, a performance. Your uncle, the high priest Hillel, enters your chamber with the morning's sacred preparations. To any observer, his movements are those of a man in the presence of divinity, reverent, filled with the weight of holy purpose. But when he catches your eye, there is something else there, something that would be invisible to a true believer. A flicker of shared understanding, a moment of human connection between conspirators in the most elaborate deception ever conceived. The morning rituals await your divine presence, he intones, his voice carrying the proper ceremonial weight. But his eyes tell a different story. They speak of the burden you both carry, the weight of maintaining a lie so fundamental to your civilization that revealing it would mean the collapse of everything your people have built. As your body is painted with the sacred symbols of your divinity, intricate patterns in blue and gold made from pigments, so rare and precious that their application, alone represents more wealth than most of your subjects will see in their lifetimes, you feel the familiar weight of performance settling upon your shoulders. Each stroke of the brush is applied with reverent care by priests who genuinely believe they are adorning the physical form of their god. The pigments burn slightly against your skin, a sensation that is entirely uncomfortably human. Yet one more reminder of the mortality you must never acknowledge. Your youngest sister, its Papalitl, approaches with your morning meal. Like your uncle, unlike the senior priests who have been brought into the inner circle of knowledge, she remains a true believer. In her eyes, you see the kind of pure faith that both sustains and torments you. She places the golden vessels before you with hands that tremble not from fear, but from the overwhelming honor of serving her divine brother. The food itself is a work of art. Delicate preparations of cacao and honey, fruits that have been carried hundreds of miles from the tropical lowlands, meat seasoned with spices worth their weight in jade. But as you eat, you are acutely aware that every bite is watched, interpreted, given meaning by those who serve you. When you favor one dish over another, it becomes a sign of divine preference that will influence trade routes and agricultural decisions across the empire. When you pause to savor a particular flavor, priests will later analyze the moment for prophetic significance. The simple human act of eating becomes another layer in the performance of godhood, another weight upon your conscience. Through the great windows of your chamber you can see the city awakening below. Tenochtitlan stretches out before you like a jewel set in the dark waters of the lake. Its canals filled with the constant traffic of canoes carrying goods and people to every corner of your domain. Smoke rises from countless hearths as families prepare their morning meals of maize and beans. Their simple fare, a stark contrast to the elaborate feast that has been prepared for your divine consumption. But it is what you cannot see from your elevated position that weighs most heavily upon your mind. In the lower levels of the Great Pyramid, in chambers that few beyond your inner circle ever enter, preparations are already underway for the day's sacrificial rituals. Men and women, captured in the endless wars that your empire wages to maintain its dominance and defeat its gods, are being prepared for deaths that they face with a mixture of terror and honor, believing that their blood will nourish the divine essence that keeps the world in balance. Your cousin Moctezuma, who serves as your chief military advisor, enters to provide the morning's reports. His manner, like that of your uncle, carries the proper ceremonial weight for public consumption, but his eyes hold the same burden of shared knowledge. Speaks of tribute flowing in from subject cities, of new territories brought under your divine rule, of prisoners taken in the latest campaigns who will soon offer their lives to sustain your supposed divine power. But as he speaks, you are both acutely aware of the human cost of maintaining the divine fiction. Every victory celebrated in your name, every tribute extracted from conquered peoples, every life sacrificed upon your altars, all of it, rests upon the foundation of a lie that you, your family, and your closest advisors have inherited from previous generations and must now perpetuate regardless of the personal cost. The weight of divine performance extends beyond the public ceremonies and into every aspect of your existence. You cannot show weakness, for gods do not grow tired, cannot express doubt, for divine will is absolute. You cannot grieve openly, for gods exist beyond the petty concerns of mortal emotion. Yet you are, beneath all the ritual and ceremony, painfully, unmistakably human. As the morning progresses, representatives from across your empire arrive to seek your divine guidance. They come bearing gifts of stunning beauty, carved jade, brilliant feathers, intricate gold work that represents the finest achievements of human craftsmanship. But they also come bearing human problems that they expect divine solutions to address. Droughts that threaten crops, diseases that spread through their communities, disputes that require the wisdom of the gods to resolve. You listen to their pleas with the appropriate divine demeanor you face, a mask of serene authority that reveals nothing of the very human anxiety. You feel it being asked to provide godlike wisdom for problems that would challenge the greatest mortal minds. Your response is carefully coached by your advisors and filtered through layers of ceremonial language, will be interpreted and reinterpreted by priests and nobles until they become prophecy, regardless of their actual meaning or effectiveness. But perhaps the most crushing aspect of your divine burden is the isolation it creates. Surrounded by thousands of people who exist to serve your every need, you are perhaps the loneliest person in your empire. Every relationship is filtered through the lens of your supposed divinity. Every conversation is stilted by the requirements of ceremony. Every human connection is compromised by the fundamental lie that separates you from all but your closest conspirators. Even among those who know the truth, relationships are complicated by the shared weight of deception. Your uncle, your cousin, the senior priests who maintain the fiction, they are bound to you not by affection or mutual respect, but by mutual complicity in a deception so vast and fundamental that its revelation would destroy not just your reign, but the very foundations of your civilization. As the morning rituals conclude, and you prepare to make your first public appearance of the day, you feel the familiar tightness in your chest that comes with the prospect of once again donning the mask of divinity. The golden ornaments that mark your divine status feel heavier each day. The feathered cloak that signifies your connection to the heavens seems to weigh upon your shoulders like a burden of guilt. For today, like every day, people will die because they believe you are a god. Warriors will march into battle carrying your divine image, confident that their God-King's power will protect them. Prisoners will walk willingly to their deaths, honored to nourish your divine essence with their blood. Families will sacrifice precious resources to honor your supposed divinity, giving up food and goods they can ill afford because they believe their God requires such offerings. And through it all, you will maintain the performance, speak the proper words, make the appropriate gestures, and carry the weight of knowing that your entire existence is built upon the most elaborate lie in human history, a lie that you inherited, that you cannot escape, and that you must perpetuate until the day you die, lest everything your people have built crumble into chaos. The sun climbs higher above Tenochtitlan, and another day of divine performance begins. But in the quiet moments before you step out to meet your worshippers, you allow yourself the luxury of one entirely human emotion: the profound, crushing weight of loneliness that comes with being the only God who knows he is merely mortal. As the morning light strengthens over the great city, casting long shadows across the carefully arranged courtyards of your palace complex, you move through the elaborate rituals that transform a human being into a living god. But today, as on every day for the past several years of your reign, you are acutely aware of the intricate machinery that makes this transformation possible, a vast network of complicit nobles, carefully coached priests, and inherited traditions that have elevated deception to the level of high art. Your education in this sacred fraud began in childhood, though you did not understand its true nature until you came of age. You remember the gradual revelation, slow dawning of awareness that the divine mysteries you had been taught to revere were, in fact, carefully orchestrated performances designed to maintain social order and political power. Your father, the previous God-King, had revealed the truth to you on his deathbed, his voice weak but urgent as he passed on the burden of maintaining a lie that had sustained your dynasty for generations. The people need their gods, he had whispered, his mortal breath failing even as priests outside the chamber maintained the fiction of his divine immortality. And we must be their gods, even if it destroys us, especially if it destroys us. The senior priests of your inner circle gather in your private chambers each morning before the public ceremonies begin. To any observer, these meetings would appear to be divine consultations, moments when the God-King communes with his most trusted spiritual advisors. But in reality, these sessions are planning meetings. Strategy sessions where the day's divine performances are choreographed with the precision of a military campaign. Telekalo, your uncle and chief priest, spreads out the astronomical charts that will guide today's prophecies. The calculations are genuine, the Aztec understanding of celestial movements is remarkably sophisticated, but their interpretation is carefully crafted to support whatever political or military objectives the empire currently requires. A lunar eclipse becomes a sign that the gods favor a particular military campaign. The appearance of Venus in the morning sky signals divine approval for a new trade agreement. The very real movements of the heavens become a kind of cosmic theater, their meaning scripted in advance by mortals who understand that divine authority requires the appearance of supernatural knowledge. The merchants from Tlatelolco seek divine guidance on their tribute obligations. Tlacalo reports, his voice carrying the proper ceremonial weight even in this private setting. They have prepared offerings of cacao and jade, but their true concern is the new trade routes through Maya territory. You nod, understanding the coded language. The divine guidance they seek is actually a negotiated political settlement, but it must be presented as the will of the gods to maintain the fiction of divine rule. Your response will be carefully crafted to appear prophetic, while actually addressing very practical concerns about trade security, tribute levels, and regional politics. Your cousin Moctezuma enters with reports from the military campaigns that constantly expand and maintain your empire's boundaries. But these reports, too, are filtered through the lens of divine performance. Victories are attributed to your divine favor. Defeats are reframed as tests of faith sent by the gods. It's a very real skill and courage of your warriors, the practical strategies that win battles, economic factors that sustain military campaigns. All of these mundane realities are translated into the language of divine intervention. The campaign in Oaxaca proceeds favorably, he reports. The local chiefs have agreed to acknowledge your divine sovereignty, and the first tribute shipments are already en route to the capital. But you know the reality behind these diplomatic words. The acknowledgement of divine sovereignty was achieved through a combination of military pressure, economic incentives, and carefully targeted violence. The tribute shipments represent the extraction of wealth from conquered peoples who have little choice but to comply. The divine language obscures what is essentially a protection racket, albeit one operated on an imperial scale. The morning's intelligence reports arrive through channels that would be invisible to ordinary citizens. Spies and informants throughout the empire feed information back to your court, but their reports must be translated into the language of divine revelation. A drought in the northern provinces becomes a sign that the gods require additional sacrifices. Political unrest in a subject city is interpreted as the result of insufficient devotion to your divine authority. The very real challenges of governing a vast empire are constantly reframed as spiritual problems requiring divine solutions. But perhaps the most elaborate aspect of the divine performance involves the management of miracles. Your court includes specialists whose sole responsibility is to create the appearance of supernatural intervention in human affairs. These men, and they are always men, carefully selected for their discretion and bound to secrecy by oaths that invoke the most terrible punishments, are masters of what we might today call special effects. When you appear before the masses at the Great Pyramid's summit, seeming to commune with the gods in the blazing sun, hidden assistants use polished mirrors to create the appearance of divine light surrounding your figure. When your voice carries across the vast plaza with supernatural clarity, it is because acoustic engineers have designed the pyramid's architecture to amplify sound from specific positions. When sacred objects seem to move of their own accord during ceremonies, nearly invisible strings and mechanical devices create the illusion of divine intervention. The most elaborate deceptions involve the coordination of natural phenomena with your public appearances. Your court astronomers and weather observers maintain detailed records that allow them to predict eclipses, storms, and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. These predictions are then incorporated into your divine pronouncements, creating the impression that you command the forces of nature itself. You remember the first time you participated in one of these orchestrated miracles during your coronation ceremony 3 years ago. As you stood before the assembled multitudes, your court magicians had arranged for a carefully timed solar eclipse to coincide with your acceptance of divine authority. The effect was stunning. Thousands of people fell to their knees as darkness fell across the city, convinced they were witnessing divine approval of their new God-King. But you had known it was coming. You'd been briefed on the timing, coached in the appropriate responses, taught to use the people's AW to maximum effect. What should have been a moment of spiritual transcendence became, instead, a masterclass in mass manipulation, a demonstration of how genuine natural phenomena could be harnessed to support political objectives. The human cost of maintaining these elaborate deceptions weighs heavily on your conscience. The specialists who create your miracles, the spies who gather intelligence, the priests who maintain the daily rituals, all of them are bound to secrecy by oaths that essentially make them prisoners of the system they serve. They cannot speak of what they know, cannot share the burden of maintaining the divine fiction, cannot seek comfort or understanding from anyone outside the conspiracy. Some of them, have cracked under the pressure. There have been mysterious disappearances, sudden deaths, cases of madness that strike those who know too much about the machinery behind the divine performance. The official explanations always involve divine intervention, the gods calling faithful servants to join them in the celestial realm, or punishing those who have somehow failed in their duties. But you suspect the reality is more mundane and more tragic. Human beings destroyed by the weight of carrying secrets too large for any individual conscience to bear. The financial cost of the divine performance is staggering. The gold and precious stones that adorn your person, the elaborate architecture of the temples, the constant festivals and ceremonies that maintain public faith, all of this requires resources that could otherwise be used to improve the lives of your subjects. Tribute flows into the capital from across the empire, but much of it is immediately consumed by the requirements of divine theater. Your palace complex employs thousands of people whose sole purpose is to maintain the fiction of your divinity. Craftsmen who create the elaborate costumes and ornaments of divine authority, servants who maintain the complex protocols that govern every aspect of your public appearances, guards who protect not just your physical safety, but the secrets that make your divine authority possible. Yet even among your co-conspirators, there are levels of knowledge and complicity. The highest-ranking priests and nobles know the full truth that your divinity is carefully maintained. Fiction designed to preserve social order and political stability. But many of the secondary participants know only parts of the larger deception. They may understand that certain miracles are artificially created, but they still believe in your fundamental divine nature. They may know that some prophecies are politically motivated, but they maintain faith in your supernatural wisdom. This graduated system of knowledge creates a hierarchy of complicity that makes the overall deception remarkably stable. Those who know the most are bound most tightly to the system, while those who know less can maintain their faith and enthusiasm for the divine performance. It is a masterpiece of organizational psychology, designed to minimize the risk of exposure while maximizing the effectiveness of the overall illusion. But the personal cost to you, as the central figure in this elaborate deception, grows heavier with each passing day. You are surrounded by people who are paid to lie to you, whose entire livelihood depends on maintaining a fiction that places you at the center of cosmic significance. Even your most trusted advisors cannot offer you genuine friendship or honest counsel, because their relationship with you is fundamentally based on a shared commitment to perpetuating a lie. The afternoon brings a series of audiences with regional governors and subject rulers who have traveled to the capital to renew their oaths of allegiance to your divine authority. Each meeting follows a carefully choreographed script, with predetermined outcomes that have been negotiated through diplomatic channels long before the formal ceremonies begin. But the governors and rulers play their parts with convincing enthusiasm, prostrating themselves before your throne, offering tribute and praise to your divine wisdom, seeking your blessing for their continued rule over their territories. You recognize the performance for what it is: political theater designed to reinforce the hierarchies that hold your empire together. But you also recognize that many of these regional leaders have become trapped in the same web of divine deception that holds you captive. They may have started as cynical political operators, but years of participating in the divine performance have created a kind of psychological dependency on the system they help maintain. As evening approaches and the day's public ceremonies conclude, you retreat to your private chambers for the most difficult part of your daily routine, the quiet hours when the divine performance ends. And you are left alone with the weight of what you have done, what you continue to do, and what you know you must do tomorrow. The golden ornaments of divine authority are carefully removed and stored by servants who handle them like sacred relics. The elaborate makeup that transforms your human features into something approaching divine perfection is gently cleansed away, revealing the tired, mortal face beneath. But even in these private moments, you are not truly alone. Guards stand watch outside your chambers. Servants remain on call to attend to your needs. And the machinery of divine deception continues to operate around you. Reports arrive from across the empire, intelligence that must be processed and incorporated into tomorrow's divine pronouncements. Requests for divine guidance accumulate on your desk, each one representing another opportunity to shape the lives of your subjects through carefully crafted lies. The weight of omniscience is perhaps the most crushing burden of all. Your subjects believe that you possess divine knowledge, that you understand the will of the gods. You can see into the future and comprehend the cosmic forces that shape their world. But you know that your wisdom is entirely human, your knowledge limited by the same constraints that affect all mortals, your understanding of the future no better than educated guesswork based on historical patterns and political analysis. Yet tomorrow, like every day, you will stand before your people and speak with divine authority about matters that you understand only imperfectly. You will offer prophecies based on astronomical calculations and political convenience. You will make pronouncements that will affect the lives of millions, knowing that your authority rests not on divine wisdom, but on an elaborate system of deception that you inherited, and that you must maintain until the day you die. The conspirators who share your burden gather in your private chambers as the day ends, their faces reflecting the same weariness that you feel in your bones. Together, you plan tomorrow's divine performance, coordinate the various elements of miraculous intervention, and manage the countless details that make godhood possible. But even among these trusted collaborators, you feel the isolation that comes with being the central figure in a deception so vast and complex that it has taken on a life of its own. For you are not just a participant in this elaborate fraud, you are its primary victim. Trapped at the center of a web of lies that grows stronger and more complex with each passing day. And tomorrow, like every day, you will wake to the sound of priests chanting outside your door, prepare your mortal body for divine performance, and carry the weight of being a God who knows with crushing certainty that he is merely human. The courtyard is still. Pools of water reflect a sky that seems undecided, a muted gray, uncertain whether to offer sun or surrender to cloud. And at the heart of this hush sits a man, dressed in the silks of the heavens, crowned with gold, but blinking, simply blinking, as if unsure if he is awake. His name is Moctezuma. To his people, he is not merely king, he is divine, a God made flesh, the Tlatoani, the one who speaks for the gods, and some say, as the gods. And yet within him, the slow erosion of certainty has begun. Imagine him walking the polished obsidian floors of his palace, each step echoing like a ritual. Every glance he offers is interpreted, every silence given a sacred weight. Even his sighs are measured and decoded. But what if behind those long silences was not divine contemplation, but fear? What if the voice of the gods was missing? Each morning, the palace awoke not to Moctezuma's voice, but to the preparation of his perfection. Every adornment, feathers placed with precision, jade beads cooled and strung, perfumes drawn from deep woods and sacred resins, was part of the illusion. The illusion that he was more than mortal. Ceremonies filled his day like tides. To the people, they were proof of his divinity. But to him, they became a quiet theater of doubt. In the dark corners of his chamber, it is said he kept private relics. Objects not meant for worship, but perhaps for remembrance. Reminders that before the gods chose him, he had once simply been a man. He had once played, laughed, loved. But that version of himself had been erased by ritual. That boy, who once ran barefoot on lake shores, now stood motionless on a stone dais, blessing a world that no longer saw the human behind the crown. In those final years, Moctezuma began to hear whispers of strangers across the sea, men who rode beasts, carried thunder in metal tubes, did not bow, did not chant, did not believe. And with those whispers came something colder than fear, something more corrosive: invalidation. For if divinity requires belief, then what does it mean when someone refuses to believe? As the Spanish approached, he did not ride out to meet them with fire. He did not command storms or split the earth. No, he sent gifts: gold, feathers, masks, perhaps hoping they would recognize his divine stature, or perhaps testing the boundaries of his fading illusion. But the strangers did not kneel. They did not see a god. They saw a man in gold, a man with a trembling voice, a man who hesitated. Let us pause here, because hesitation in the Aztec world was not a flaw. It was a revelation. It meant the gods were unsure. If the gods were unsure, then the world trembled. Moctezuma's court, like a delicate web, began to quiver. Priests whispered behind veils. Nobles watched with sharp, unreadable eyes. Some began to wonder, quietly, cautiously, if perhaps the Tlatoani had lost his divine favor, or worse, if he had never truly had it. And yet the rituals continued. Fires were lit, the altars cleaned, sacrifices made. Moctezuma stood at the center of this grand performance, his body dressed as the gods required, his voice echoing across temple courtyards. But his mind wandered, his heart trembled. In private, he withdrew. Some said he fasted, others said he wept. He is said to have spoken to the stars at night, asking them for guidance. But stars do not speak, they simply burn. There are accounts, soft as breath, that in those last months, Moctezuma barely slept, that he stood on his balconies at dusk, staring toward the sea, his eyes not on the horizon, but somewhere far beyond it. The rituals continued, the sacrifices continued, the mask remained. But inside, something was unraveling. He began to question the very system that had raised him, trapped him, and now demanded he defend it. And then the silence broke. The invaders entered the city, not with reverence, but with boots and banners and blades. The priests looked to him. The nobles waited. People uncertain turned upward to the one they called God, expected thunder, fire, magic, deliverance. But Moctezuma only stepped forward and spoke, not as a god, not as a savior, but as a man. There are many tales of how he died. Some say the Spanish killed him. Others say his own people turned on him, disgusted by his perceived weakness, his lack of power. But beneath these stories lies a possibility too quiet for the scrolls, that perhaps, in the end, Moctezuma allowed it. That death was not a punishment, but a release. A soft escape from the unbearable weight of being worshipped for something you are not, of being the only one in a kingdom of millions who knows the truth and who carries that truth in silence. You can imagine, gently now, the moments just before. Perhaps he sat alone. The great hall's empty. Perhaps the sounds of celebration outside no longer reached him. Perhaps, for the first time in his life, he spoke his own name aloud, a name only a few remembered, a name not spoken in years, and maybe in that moment he felt human again, just a man, not a symbol, not a mask, not a god, just a man. And in that final breath, the illusion collapsed. But the silence it left behind would echo for centuries. He was remembered as both traitor and martyr, as fool and mystic. But perhaps Moctezuma was simply tired, not of ruling, but of pretending. pretending to speak for gods who never spoke back, pretending to bless wars he never wanted, pretending that gold was not a curse and blood not a stain. His fall was not thunderous. It was quiet, kind of quiet that only comes when belief dies softly, and sleep finally comes. Beneath the remains of the great, where now the bustling heart of Mexico City beats, the bones of a forgotten empire sleep. The earth here is layered with stone, with time and with silence. But from that silence, the past has begun to whisper. In recent decades, archaeologists have carefully brushed away centuries of soil and myth to reveal what lies beneath the foundations of palaces and temples. What they've found is not just grandeur, not merely gold or obsidian blades, but something far more fragile, signs of inner torment, quiet confessions etched in plaster and ritual, and the emotional residue of men burdened with divinity. You see, not all ruins shout, some only murmur. Those murmurs have stories to tell. In what is believed to be the private quarters of royal elites, perhaps even Moctezuma himself's, mall rooms have been unearthed. Tucked away from the public ritual spaces of the ceremonial core, these are not grand temples, nor open courtyards. They are narrow, windowless spaces. Spaces of retreat. Within them, murals line the walls. Unlike the bold public depictions of gods triumphant and warriors ascendant, these are softer, stranger, and more sorrowful. One painting shows a jaguar curled into itself, no claws bared, no teeth shown, but hunched, as if mourning. Another reveals a god's eye shedding tears that become rivers. In yet another, a great stone heart floats above a mountain, bleeding into the clouds. These are not public images, they are private reflections. Confessions in pigment. What do they mean? Scholars debate. But many believe these murals are expressions of spiritual fatigue, the weight of pretending to be divine, the private unspoken doubts of men who were told they were gods. Beside the murals, strange icons were discovered. Tiny figurines made in styles foreign to the central Mexica, aesthetic, Maya, even Totonac elements. Hidden beneath floor stones, embedded behind false panels, these pieces may represent personal acts of spiritual searching, perhaps even rebellion. One figurine, carved from bone and no larger than a thumb, bears an unfamiliar symbol, spiral inside a teardrop. It was wrapped in maize husks and buried beneath a private altar. It speaks not of empire. It speaks of loneliness. Chemical analysis of vessels found in these quarters revealed residues of ololiaqui and peyote, powerful hallucinogenic plants. Traditionally associated with ritual communion, their presence in private, non-ceremonial contexts has led some to speculate that these were not used for official vision quests. They were used alone. Perhaps not to connect with the gods, but to escape the expectation of being one. Imagine this: a ruler surrounded by priests and warriors in gold, sitting alone in a stone chamber lit only by flickering torchlight. In his hand, a cup of bitter liquid, not drunken celebration, but to soften the world, to blur the boundaries of self, to forget the unbearable performance for just a few hours. Even gods, it seems, may have needed dreams. Another chamber, particularly haunting, revealed what researchers now call a withdrawal cell, small, barely larger than a sleeping mat. Its walls bear no decoration, save for faint lines scratched into the stone. Not glyphs, not art, just marks. Repetitive, uneven, as if someone left alone too long needed to leave a trace of their presence, or perhaps their vanishing. The room had no ventilation, no windows, only a single extinguished sconce and a shallow basin for water. It was not a prison. There was no lock. But it was unmistakably a place to disappear. What kind of man built himself a space to vanish in his own palace? Perhaps one who could no longer breathe in rooms filled with reverence. And then there are the bones. In royal tombs, remains believed to belong to high-ranking nobles, possibly even rulers, display unusual features. Forensic studies have shown signs of long-term musculoskeletal stress, compression in the vertebrae, arthritis in the knees, evidence of chronic jaw clenching. These are not the wounds of warriors. They are the signatures of tension, of worry carried in the body. Some skulls show severe enamel wear from teeth grinding, a condition linked with anxiety. Some ribs show signs of microfractures not consistent with battle, but with deep, repeated chest tension. It is as if the body itself was trying to contain something the mind could not speak aloud. Stress leaves traces, even in stone, even in bone. One tomb held a cracked obsidian mirror laid across the chest of the deceased. Traditionally, such a mirror represents Tezcatlipoca, the smoke mirror, god of destiny and reflection. But this one was broken, useless, shattered before burial. Was it a symbol of failure, of an identity fractured beyond repair? Or was it an act of quiet defiance, a declaration that the mask no longer fit, that the mirror no longer showed the truth? Perhaps it was all of these. Perhaps it was an ending. Even today, not all scholars agree on these interpretations. Some argue these were simply rooms of purification. Others say they belonged not to kings, but to high priests who bore the burden of ritual coordination. But the patterns are difficult to ignore. The repetition of hidden icons, the murals of despair, the biochemical traces of isolation and escape, the architecture of retreat. All of it suggests something more than ritual, more than power. It suggests grief. If we listen carefully, the stones speak, not in declarations, but in sighs. They tell us that even in a world ruled by gods, there was space for doubt, and that the men we call rulers may have lived with that doubt every day. It may not have been safe to voice their questions aloud, so they hid them in paint, in scratches, silence. And now, centuries later, we find them again, unfolding gently beneath our fingers, reaching up from the earth to whisper, ... That godhood, too, is a kind of exile, and that those we place highest on our altars may suffer most when the lights go out. Imagine waking each morning to the sound of bells, not alarms, soft chimes, rung by unseen hands. The scent of burning copal drifts through corridors before you ever open your eyes. Your sleeping chamber is not large, but everything within it is sacred. The mat on which you sleep is embroidered with glyphs invoking protection. The vessel of water by your side was gathered from a mountain spring and blessed with flower petals. You are the most powerful person in the empire, the Tlatoani, a god on earth. But nothing in your world belongs to you, not your time, not your voice, not even your name. The divine Aztec court was a place of immense wealth and beauty. The halls of the palace shimmered with turquoise mosaics and feathered tapestries. Musicians played slow, rhythmic instruments to mark time. Servants moved like shadows, trained never to make eye contact with the divine. You were always dressed, never dressing yourself. You were always served, never choosing the meal. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. But to you, it was a carefully choreographed illusion, one that you could never leave. Every word you spoke was scripted, every gesture symbolic. Even your silence was interpreted by priests and advisors who believed your breath carried divine insight. To cough was a message. To sigh was a decree. To make a mistake was unthinkable. Perfection wasn't a goal, it was a prison. Even your food was sacred. Served in painted ceramic bowls, meals were arranged according to ritual schedules. Tamales infused with wildflowers, chocolate frothed and spiced but never sweetened. Each bite was tasted by a servant first, not to check for poison, but to ensure spiritual compatibility. Food was offered to the gods before it ever touched your lips, and if you disliked a meal, you could not complain. You were beyond desire. Desire, after all, was human. Throughout the day, your presence was demanded, not requested. Rituals for the sun, blessings for the army. Consultations with the priesthood. Audience with foreign emissaries. Each appearance was a play. Before stepping into public view, your skin was painted, your head adorned. Your robes adjusted and readjusted to align with seasonal iconography. You did not walk. You processed, did not speak. You pronounced. You were a symbol. Symbols cannot bend. At the center of this divine theater was a profound loneliness. You were surrounded by hundreds, but touched by none. No one laughed with you. No one spoke freely. Conversations were layered in formality and fear. Even your children, if you had them, approached you like a deity. They bowed. They averted their gaze, right? They memorized the rituals that surrounded you before they ever knew your face. And at night, when the songs of the priests faded, you returned to your chamber alone. You might lie there for hours, unmoving, not from fatigue, but because motion without meaning had no place in your world. Historians suggest that the emperor could not perform even the most basic tasks for himself. He did not tie his sandals. He did not pour his drink. He could not express spontaneous joy because it would imply unpredictability, and unpredictability was incompatible with divine order. There are accounts of emperors falling ill, refusing to let the sickness show. To vomit, even in privacy, required a priest's blessing. To cry was considered cosmic imbalance. If you were seen weeping, the stars might tremble. And so you did not weep. You endured. The palace was a fortress, yes, but it was also a mirror maze. Every hallway reflected the expectations of others. Every chamber echoed with divine precedent. The pressure to maintain continuity with past rulers was immense. You dressed like them. You quoted them. You even dreamed of them, guided by ritual dream interpreters who read your sleep like scripture. But you never dreamed for yourself. Your dreams belonged to the state. Ceremonial baths were one of the few moments of physical privacy allowed. In shallow pools surrounded by incense and silence, you were bathed by attendants who sang old songs. The water was cold, not because of neglect, but because it symbolized clarity. To bathe was not for hygiene, but for ritual purity. The skin was scrubbed, not to clean, but to restore its symbolic sheen. You emerged not refreshed, but renewed, not lighter, but more burdened. There were moments, perhaps, when the facade cracked, a stumble on the temple steps, a fever that left your vision clouded, a moment of hesitation when asked to name the next ritual. And when these moments came, the palace trembled. Priests gathered to interpret your lapse. Advisors speculated about divine warnings. And you were surrounded gently by layers of sacred correction, not to punish, but to preserve the illusion. To remind you who you were expected to be, not a man, a god. Outside the palace walls, life thrived in chaos and color. Children played in canal water. Merchants argued over the price of maize. Lovers met beneath flower-laden trellises. It was a world of imperfection, of spontaneity. You watched it from above, from behind gold-paneled screens. You could not enter that world, could only bless it from afar. So the palace became a paradox. It was filled with treasures, but void of comfort. It was rich in ritual, but poor in laughter. It offered glory without joy, devotion without intimacy, power without freedom. It was a crown made of smoke and mirrors, and you wore it with grace, because to drop it would be to unmake the world. The most haunting truth of the divine court is this, that in giving you everything, it took away the one thing no one else could hold for you. Yourself, your simple, human self. That boy who once ran beside the lake, who laughed at stories, who held a mother's hand, he was gone, replaced by ritual, by titles, by silence. And if, in your final days, you stood alone in a golden room and whispered your real name into the darkness, no one would hear you, because no one remembered. Not even you. You were tired, so tired of the charade. Each morning you woke to prayers offered to a lie, to a mask. You were worshipped, yes, but it was not you they worshipped. It was the idea of you. The shell, the costume, the illusion. From the moment you could walk, the myth had been wrapped around you. Every teacher, every servant, every priest shaped your voice, your stride, your breath. They molded you into what they needed, a living God, a perfect mask. You learned how to sit for hours without moving. You were taught to lower your gaze to no one. They measured your silences. They praised your stillness. You were the mirror in which the empire saw its power reflected. One day, you decided to speak, to tell them, not all at once, not in revolt, but with gentleness. You began to hint in your gestures, in your decrees. You removed the godhood from your voice and replaced it with something softer truth. You loosened the language of rituals. You paused the sacrifices. You asked questions. You said the rains come not because you demand them, but because the clouds choose to fall. You said that death is not always sacred, that sacrifice is not the only path to balance. You said you were born just like them, a boy, a son, a soul, not a god. They did not understand. The priests whispered. The nobles looked away. The silence in the temple thickened. Rituals resumed, but now with an edge. Offerings doubled. Consultations with the ancestors were demanded. The people, unsettled, turned their eyes upward again, searching for certainty in the face of your doubt. Then came the gathering, a festival. Thousands in the square. Was the perfect moment. You would speak clearly this time, no more riddles. You would step down from the altar and walk among them as one of them. You had spent the night awake, rehearsing not a speech, but a truth, the truth of your humanity. You raised your hands, you opened your mouth, and before the words could finish, the blade found your back. It was quick. It had to be. Not for your sake, it's for theirs. You fell before the altar. The people screamed. The priests cried divine betrayal. But even as your blood ran down the steps, they spun the story. The god has left the shell, they said. He has moved to another vessel. The chants began again, not in mourning, but in reassurance. They brought out a young relative of yours, barely past childhood, painted in fresh, sacred dye, his face stoic, his eyes confused. But the people believed. They had to. The illusion had to live, even if you could not. Your death, meant as revelation, became their proof of continuity. The empire could not afford a man. It needed a god. So your death gave them exactly what they wanted. Your sacrifice became legend. Your truth buried beneath incense and song, you awoke adrift. Watching, your body was gone, but you remained, not vengeful, not bitter, but aching. You watched the child speak your lines, walk your halls. You saw the same weight you once carried settle onto his young shoulders. You remembered how heavy it had felt, how the silence grew thicker with each year, how the mask began to suffocate, and you knew it would break him too. But what could you do? You were no longer flesh, only breath, only shadow. Still you lingered. You tried to speak to him, to the new god, to the boy. You tried to whisper at night, to show him his own dreams. But the rituals around him were thick and heavy. The voices of the priests drowned out yours. The bells and smoke filled his mind with what they wanted him to be. You stood in the corners of the palace watching. You hovered near the old mural that showed you crowned in gold. You stood beside your own statue and remembered how cold it had always been. Perhaps one day someone else would listen. Someone not yet born. Someone who would hear your truth not from a temple, but in the quiet of their dreams. Someone like you who would dare to speak and not be silenced. In that future, you wait, you wander, through temples, through forests, through marketplaces and alleyways. You sit by fires where stories are told and listen to your name reshaped into myth. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they call you cruel. Sometimes they call you wise. Sometimes they say nothing at all. You visit the homes of the poor, where incense does not burn and gods are not spoken of. There you find children drawing in dust, and in their drawings, a shape like your crown, a figure standing not above, but beside, a face drawn with sadness. You linger by their dreams. You hum lullabies no priest ever taught, and you wait. You see signs in strange places, an old woman who stops mid-prayer and stares at the sky, sensing something beyond what she was taught. A man who refuses to kneel, even though his father did, and his father's father before him. A girl who closes her eyes and says, "I don't think he wanted to be worshipped." Each time you feel the ache lessen, just a little, you return to the place where you died. The altar is still there, but now cracked. Moss grows in its corners. Tourists take pictures. Children climb its steps. No one sacrifices here anymore. You sit at the base. You close your eyes. And for the first time in a long time, you do not feel alone. You are no longer a god, no longer a man, just a voice, patient, waiting to be heard, but no longer afraid of being forgotten. Because in the quiet, you have learned something the empire never did. That truth is not loud. It does not ride in on fire or thunder. It does not demand temples or blood. It waits. It endures. And one day, even the deepest myth breaks open. Something living steps out. You are not welcomed into the afterlife. No, God's met you. No ancestors, no golden stairways or obsidian rivers. There was no judgment, no weighing of hearts, no final embrace. Only the vast hush of the world beyond. A liminal space, cold, unmarked, open. But you did not pass on. You lingered, you watched. Not because you were cursed, not because you were angry, because you were needed. Even in death, you understood what your people still did not. That the cycle had to break. That the illusion could not endure forever. That a better world would not rise from worship or war but from small moments of kindness. Of truth, you became a spirit, not of vengeance, but of guidance, invisible, unnamed. And so you began. You whispered to those who were lost. A farmer who dropped to his knees in the field was begging for rain not from the sky, but from a God he was told still watched. You stood beside him. You placed silence in his heart. And when he stood, he felt calm, not because of you, but because he chose to believe in something simpler. The earth, his hands, his seeds. You touched the dreams of a child too young to understand ritual. She had been told to bow, to chant, to obey. But in her sleep she met someone, a man in white, his eyes tired, his voice soft. He asked her what she believed. When she awoke, she didn't know his name, but she remembered the question. And for the first time, she asked it aloud. You walked the rooftops of cities, the ruins of temples. You drifted through storms and campfires, through stories told and forgotten. You passed unseen in ceremonies, watching the priests speak your name, praying to your image. But you were not there. You were with the mother whose child was sick, who offered her last piece of bread to a statue. You stood beside her not to take the offering, but to remind her that love itself is sacred. Not the trade, not the altar, the care, the trembling hands. You watched the gods carved from stone fall into rivers, their faces cracked, their thrones empty. You felt no sorrow, it's only release. For every idol broken, another soul might breathe. So you continued, not as the ruler, not as the one worshipped, but as the one who listened. You helped quietly. A gust of wind before a fall, a sense of stillness and panic, a warmth and unbearable grief, small things, barely felt, easily dismissed, but they mattered. You didn't need temples, you had the world, you had memory, you had time. You learned that gods who demanded blood were never gods at all. You helped a young boy carry water up a steep hill. He stumbled, again and again. He had been told that if he spilled a drop his family would suffer. You steadied his hand. You calmed his fear. When he reached the top, he cried not from pain but from relief. And though he never saw you, he whispered, "Thank you." That was enough. That was worship. And sometimes you stood in the ruins of your old life and spoke aloud. You said the words you never could in life. I forgive you. I'm sorry. I understand now. You spoke to the child who replaced you, now grown, worn, alone. He felt something once, a breeze when there was no wind, a voice that sounded like memory. He looked at your statue, and for the first time he cried. Not because he felt abandoned, but because he finally saw the man inside the god. You had helped him too, and you stayed with him until his final breath. Then you walked with him a while, until he, too, became part of the silence, and now you are 2, then 3, then more. A family of forgotten gods who chose to stay, not to rule, not to be worshipped, but to help, to listen, to love. You do not seek resurrection. You do not want glory. You want a world where no child bows from fear, where no offering is made from guilt, where people are seen not as vessels, but as voices. And in your small way, you are building it, one whisper at a time. You are no longer the God-King. You are no longer the lie. You are the truth between breaths, the warmth behind a thought, the silence that stays when prayers end. And if someone someday walks into the woods and speaks aloud, I don't know what I believe, but I want to be kind. You will be there, listening, smiling, and helping. You followed it now, through the forgotten corners of the empire, through ruins that once bore your name, through dreams twisted with fear, slithered between belief and obedience, never touching either but shaping both. It had whispered to the priests, not in words, but in comfort, the kind that says, "This is easier than truth." It had sat beside the generals, not as a command, but as permission. It's a kind that says, "What you do is necessary." It had been with you too. When you first heard the screams during sacrifice, it had told you they were holy. When you looked into the eyes of the condemned and saw doubt, it had told you to look away. When you wanted to speak, to reveal the truth, it had offered silence as sanctuary. Now you understood. It was not evil in the way people imagined. Not chaos, not fire. It was erosion. The slow smoothing of conscience, the gentle coaxing of doubt into doctrine. You found it in a cave beneath the old mountain, where once a temple stood, where no birds sang. You did not see it, but you felt it. It welcomed you, not with words, but with familiarity. You again. It seemed to say it did not fear you. It knew you had once obeyed it. You asked it, not with sound, but with spirit. Why? Why me? Why them? It replied with stillness. Then slowly images rose in your mind. Cities, thrones, children lifting knives in your name, blood, gold, songs sung to idols, all things it had watched, all things it had gently guided, never forcing, only encouraging. You felt rage and sorrow and guilt, but you did not strike it. You could not. It had no form, no heart, only shadow. In a long memory, it asked you, in its cold way, "Why do you still linger?" You answered to unmake you. It laughed. It's a kind of laugh that echoes in dry bones, that dances in silence. "You are forgotten," it said. "I am not." And that was true. You visited the markets, the kitchens, the fields. You whispered not of gods, but of love. Not of sacrifice, but of community. You told mothers to hold their children when they cried. You told elders to share their doubts. You reminded people that being wrong is not a sin, that silence does not mean truth. And slowly, in corners the shadow never watched, candles were lit, not in worship, but in defiance. Small flames, many hands, and you knew the shadow could not die, but it could starve. You returned to the cave years later. It was smaller, quieter, the echo of it weaker. You did not speak. It did not greet you. You only placed a stone at the entrance, not to seal it, to mark it, a warning. For others, you had wandered for centuries, first with sorrow, then with purpose. Now, at last, with clarity. For all your travels, all your whispers into sleeping hearts and open minds, there remained a truth untouched, one that had always been near but never named. You had witnessed temples rise and fall, kingdoms crumble and reform, beliefs shift, rituals twist. But something deeper had stayed the same, not the shadow, not the lie, but the need for it. People do not believe in gods because gods are real. They believe because gods are necessary, because the unknown terrifies, because justice delayed must be divine, because death must mean something, because order must have a name. That was your final lesson. The God you were was never you. But neither was it the priest's creation alone. It was theirs, all of them. The farmers, the mothers, the scribes, the builders, the children. They made you because they needed to, because a man cannot hold the sky in his hands, but a God can. You sat by a river, once sacred, now forgotten. The stones still remembered prayers. You could feel them humming. There you saw a child alone, speaking to the water. He did not know your name, did not fear your silence. He just spoke, and you listened. That too was a kind of worship. And in that moment you realized something else. You were no longer bound to the empire. You were bound to the truth. And truth, like water, flowed where it pleased. The boy told the river about his pain, how his father shouted, how his mother wept, how the stars felt cold. You did not promise him rain. You did not bless his crops. You did not anoint him king. You only stayed. And he smiled. Perhaps that was the final truth. That presence without promise was more sacred than all the sacrifices. You walked with him for a time, in dreams, in waking thoughts. You showed him images not of power, but of choices, of a world shaped by kindness, not fear. And when he grew, he did not call himself God, but he spoke in ways that reminded people how to live. He told stories. He listened. But for a while the candles stayed lit. The shadow never vanished, but it faded, because people remembered. Not your name, not your crown, but the echo of your footsteps in their thoughts. You were not reborn. You were not returned. You were not needed. And so you rested. Not in heaven, not in stone, but in the quiet, the space between dreams and waking, the moment before belief becomes blindness, in the choice to love without demand. There you wait, not as a god, not as a ghost, but as the truth. And when the next child wonders aloud to the wind, why must it be this way? You will be there, not to answer, but to listen. And in that you will be eternal. You pass through forgotten cities with overgrown pyramids and humming stones. Each structure a reminder of devotion born from desperation. You lingered near fires where elders recited myths that barely resembled you, yet carried the same yearning for purpose. A grandmother, tracing constellations in the night sky, spoke of gods hiding in the stars. Oh, she did not know you, but her words warmed the spirit world like incense. She spoke gently, the way people do when they want children to sleep and remember. In a distant land, a market bustled with color and life. Laughter rang from corners of shade. A musician strummed something older than memory. You heard it like an echo bouncing from the bones of a lost temple. Music held you in place longer than any prayer. You did not speak, but still the strings moved you. That was the power of presence. Not commanding, but connecting. Not divine, but alive. You found yourself in paintings and dreams, in tales of fire and feathered serpents. Some cast you as villain, others as savior. It did not matter. What mattered was the curiosity you left behind, asked the way people asked questions instead of bowing their heads. A man in solitude wondered aloud why gods would demand silence if they truly loved humanity. That question echoed louder than 1,000 hymns. You lingered in his thoughts longer than the idols ever did. You became less a being and more a thought, less a presence and more a mirror. People saw in you what they feared, what they desired, what they had lost. Some carved your image on jewelry, others erased you from scrolls. But the truth was in neither act. It was in the tension between remembering and forgetting, between worship and rejection. In that friction, you found your freedom. You no longer lingered near rituals. You found sanctity in the mundane. A woman sweeping a courtyard at dawn whispered words to the wind. She didn't ask for miracles, only strength. A boy returning from the fields paused at a hill, eyes closed, feeling the breeze. These were your new temples, not built of stone, but of intention. They did not last. They mattered. A storyteller crossed rivers and villages, carrying only a carved stick and a woven bag. He told stories of a god who once loved too deeply and walked away so people could be free. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they forgot. He never gave the god a name. That was how you knew he had touched truth. In a forest clearing, a circle of children lit candles. Not to pray, not to ask, but to remember. One said, "Maybe we don't need gods to be good." The others nodded. You stood beside them, invisible but present. Their quiet made the forest seem holy. Their wonder was enough to keep the stars watching. You are no longer waiting to be remembered. You are waiting to be understood. And even if no one ever does, you are no longer afraid, because the final truth is this: you were never meant to be eternal, only meaningful. And that is more than enough. The wind that carries their stories now carries your breath. The soil that grows their food still remembers your footsteps. You are in the whisper before decision, in the breath before confession, in the stillness that follows understanding. You are not gone. You are not God. You are the truth that lives when all else is forgotten. And when the next empire rises, when the next lie finds its voice in robes and rituals, you will not rage, you will not warn, you will simply wait for the child who will ask, for the silence that will break, for the soul that will listen not to power but to peace. And in that listening, you will rise again, not as a king, not as a deity, but as a question, a beginning, a truth that whispers gently. What if it didn't have to be this way? Long after the great stones of your temples had crumbled, after the names of cities had dissolved into dust, and the blood-streaked altars were overtaken by moss and time, your story lingered. It did not endure in Scripture. It did not survive in the chants of priests or the carvings of artisans. It survived in something quieter, something more enduring. Doubt. Doubt not as weakness, but as seed. The seed of a question that spread through generations like wind through tall grass. You were not resurrected, but you were reimagined. First in fragments, in shadowy parables passed around hearths, myths half sung and forgotten. They called you by other names, added wings to your back, stars to your brow, fire to your breath. But at the center, always, was the same wound. A God who once lived among them and did not ask to be worshipped. A God who whispered, not roared, who fled, not ruled, who questioned, not commanded. The story twisted with time, as all stories do. In one version, you were a fallen angel who wept at the cruelty done in your name. In another, you were a trickster spirit who impersonated a god to free people from the grip of tyrants. In yet another, you were never real at a lonely, a dream shared by a civilization that had grown tired of obedience. Each version reflected the hopes and fears of those who carried it forward. Each version kept the ember alive. In an old library beneath a crumbling observatory, a scholar found a clay tablet wrapped in linen. His grandfather watched and frowned. "Why do you draw that?" The boy shrugged. "It feels like something I forgot." He did not know your name, but he felt your weight. And in time, he would tell stories to his children, and they would listen not to obey, but to remember. In this way, your legacy endured not in power, but in presence. You were not the god of armies, of lightning, of thrones. You were the god of pause, of hesitation, of the quiet voice that asks, why? You did not grant blessings, you offered mirrors. And in a world built on obedience, a mirror is the most dangerous gift of all. Empires rose, empires fell. New gods came, demanding loyalty, promising paradise, delivering control. But always beneath their altars, beneath the noise and incense, your silence remained. A silence not empty, but waiting. Waiting for the next child, the next poet, the next dreamer who would see the contradiction and choose curiosity over comfort. And sometimes they did. A playwright in a distant city wrote of a divine impostor who chose mortality. The play was banned, not before it touched 1,000 minds. Some are woven from belief. And it was your story that taught them this, that the greatest freedom was the freedom to doubt, that God should be questioned even when they wear human faces, especially when they wear human faces. Some tried to revive the old ways, built temples again, recreated rituals from half-remembered scripts. But something had changed. People no longer bowed. They walked the temples like museums, not to worship, but to learn, not to kneel, but to understand. And in their eyes, you saw it. They did not need you anymore. And that, finally, meant you had one, because your legacy was not belief. It was awakening. You were never meant to be obeyed. You were meant to be outgrown. It's like scaffolding on a great building, necessary in the beginning, but abandoned once the foundation was strong. You were the whisper that asked, "Do you see it differently now?" And some did. A philosopher in a glowing city taught students beneath a holographic tree. He told the tale of the god who chose to disappear. They laughed at first, but later, in silence, one of them wept. Not because the story was sad, but because it was familiar. Because they, too, had once played roles they did not choose. Worn masks they could not remove. And hearing your tale gave them permission to stop pretending. Your legend became a balm for the disillusioned, for the weary, for those crushed beneath the weight of roles they never asked for. You were a reminder that it was okay to step back, to question, to walk away from the expectations others forced upon you. That sometimes the most divine thing a person can do is say, "No more." In a monastery high in the mountains, a monk lit candles each night, not to call upon gods, but to remember those who tried to become more than human and paid the price. He spoke your story to the wind. Right. Not for answers, but to honor the questions you left behind. And in the flicker of those candles, you danced. And still, the world turned. Cities became stars, language changed. The planet shook and sighed and healed. And through it all, you endured not as a being, but as a parable, as a memory encoded in dreams and lullabies and the spaces between breaths. You were no longer confined to Mesoamerica. You were a story every civilization told in its own way, of power mistaken for divinity, of men mistaken for gods, and of the redemption that came not through glory, but through surrender. In a final vision, you stood on a shore of light, wisdom, and with it, the promise that maybe next time the truth will come first. It began not with thunder or revelation, but with quiet, with the absence of ritual, with temples that were no longer swept, with incense that no longer curled into the sky. You watched it unfold, not with bitterness, but with the same reverence a tree might have for its falling leaves. Not everything that dies is a tragedy. Some things fade so something else might grow. Where once your name was invoked in war cries and whispered in final prayers, now it was a question, a murmur in philosophy halls, a metaphor in books, a ghost in song. People no longer feared you. They no longer worshipped you, but they remembered. And remembrance, stripped of obedience, is the highest honor a once God can receive. You found yourself in stories, not just the old ones, but the new. In tales of reluctant kings and false prophets, of rulers who renounced power and disappeared. Children heard these and asked, why would anyone give up being a god? And the answer was always the same, because he was tired, because he loved them, because he remembered he was human. Some places they built no new gods. Not because they had no need, but because they had grown used to asking questions, to sitting with doubt. They lit candles, not to call the divine, but to honor the unknown. I'm there, in that sacred uncertainty you lived. There were moments when they tried to bring you back, not out of devotion, but nostalgia. They remade your mask in gold, reenacted your rituals. But they did so with a twinkle in their eyes, like children playing dress-up. The weight was gone, the terror absent, the lie exposed. You had become a story, not a chain. Among ruins reclaimed by forest, a woman painted murals of you not in your divinity, but in your loneliness. She painted the way your hands trembled, the way your eyes looked past the horizon, always searching. She painted not to honor a god, but to mourn a man. Her brushstrokes wept for you in ways priests never did. In digital cathedrals, voices sang your name in languages you never spoke. They called you not to return, but to be understood. They did not seek miracles, only meaning. And in their harmony, you felt it, the thread that still connected them to you, even across centuries and silence. A man in a quiet room wrote your story again, this time as a warning. He spoke of the danger in mistaking reverence for reality, of the peril in turning pain into prophecy, he wrote. Not with anger, but with care. Because even lies, when believed deeply enough, deserve a gentle burial. The world did not stop for you. It turned, it healed. And you, for the first time, were allowed to watch it without having to shape it, without being its reason, without being its prisoner. The earth no longer cried out your name in thunder, it whispered it in wind and waves and the soft hush of trees. And you listened. In dreams some still saw you, not as you were, but as you might have been. A companion, a wanderer. A voice beside the fire saying, you are enough. You do not need to be divine. They no longer needed your miracles, only your memory. And in that, you were more powerful than ever, because you no longer had to pretend. You no longer had to wear the mask. You were not the God they wanted, but you became the truth they found, and that was more than enough. You had become something else entirely. You had become free, but the silence was not the end. It became a soil. In that silence, people began to imagine new ways to live, not ruled by gods, but guided by compassion. They remembered the danger of worship, how easily awe turns into obligation, so they built shrines to gratitude instead. Altars where they left pieces of joy drawings, songs, names of loved ones. These were not offerings. They were acknowledgments. You saw children plant trees where temples once stood. They called it the forest of honesty. They said the trees grew taller when someone admitted they were wrong. And so people came, not to beg for mercy, but to confess, to laugh, to weep beneath the leaves. And the forest listened. The city, an old woman wrote a play about your final days. She imagined you wandering through the marketplace in disguise, trying to return shoes you never wore. She wrote it as a comedy, and when people laughed, you felt something heal. Because laughter, too, is sacred. There were scholars who debated your life, whether you existed, whether your deeds were real. But what mattered was not the facts, it was the feelings. The stories had outlived the stones. The meaning outlived the monument. You were no longer a lesson in obedience. You'd become a lesson in letting go. And in that letting go, people found each other without the need to dominate, without the fear of divine punishment, without the walls of priest and peasant. Just people, trying, failing, loving anyway. You had become a whisper inside their choices, a ghost in every gentle refusal to harm, a memory in every act of kindness done without reward. And so your afterlife stretched not in fire or paradise, but in the ripples of unspoken influence. One morning a child asked his mother, "Was there ever a God who got tired of being worshipped?" She smiled. She told him your story. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He just listened, and in his silence, you bloomed, not in power, in peace. There were always rumors, small voices in quiet corners that you might one day return, not as a god, but as something else, a witness, perhaps. A soul that had wandered long enough through memory to find peace in watching. A return that wasn't a descent or an arrival, but a stillness, like the settling of dust after centuries of storm. In markets filled with new gods, where worship was traded for influence and miracles outsourced to algorithms, your absence became a kind of presence. You were invoked not to demand obedience, but to remind the world of the price it once paid for certainty. Your story, it turned out, was not about the divine. It was about the cost of pretending to be. Children ask questions their ancestors never dared. Why did the God let it happen? Why didn't he speak? What did he eat? These were not accusations, but invitations to demystify, to humanize, to bring the sacred back into reach. And so your story changed? Again, not all who heard it understood. Some still longed for your return, not as you were, but as they imagined you fierce, radiant, commanding. They built statues from the bones of old beliefs, dressing them in gold and prophecy. They did not ask if you wanted to return. They demanded it. But you had already returned in their doubts, their laughter, their capacity to tell the story differently, and the fact that they no longer needed you to be perfect. They only needed you to have been, and so the return came every time someone forgave. Every time someone chose honesty over grandeur. Every time a leader said, "I don't know." Every time a teacher admitted their mistakes. Every time someone walked away from a pedestal and sat beside others instead. You returned in those moments, not as a guide, but as a guidepost, a whisper saying, "You do not need to ascend, you only need to stay." And that was enough. The world no longer bowed. It breathed. And you, once worshipped, now watched content to be forgotten. 'Cause in that forgetting, they finally remembered themselves. You had returned by never coming back. And that was the miracle they didn't expect. The one that changed everything. But time, unhurried and unworshipping, moved on. Cities rose on the bones of empires. Children were born in homes without altars. Temples became archives. Rituals became plays. The divine became art. And you were still there, not in the sky, but in the breath between questions. In the space between certainty and wonder, a century passed, then two. Your name, once sung in chorus, became a footnote in the margins. But in those margins, someone always lingered. A scholar in a dusty room who traced the glyphs, not for belief but for meaning. A poet who whispered your name into a poem about solitude. A sculptor who carved your image, not from reverence but from memory. They did not know you, but they felt you. In quiet choices, in small mercies, in the refusal to punish doubt. And in that echo, you lived. The world invented new gods of commerce, of speed, of attention. They demanded more than blood. They asked for hours, for selves, for everything. But people remembered what happened the last time they bowed too low, believed too hard, gave too much, and so they held back. They built walls, not around altars, but around themselves. They protected the space where no God should enter, space of thought, of contradiction, of silence. In that silence, your name returned, not shouted, not screamed, just spoken, as one might speak a friend who left long ago, but whose footprints remain. The return that never comes became the story that never ends. And still you waited, not to be called, but to be let go. 'Cause only then could the world begin again, and it did. Gardens grown over ruins, and kindness offered without reward, and eyes that looked skyward and saw no gods but still said, "Thank you." The return was never a moment. It was a process. It was every quiet refusal to repeat the past. It was every time a child asked, "But why?" It was not silenced. It was every story that ended not in triumph or tragedy, but in peace. That is what you gave them, after all. Not commandments, but a question. What will you do now that you are free? And their answer was to live, not for gods, but for each other. That was the return, and it was always enough. But the world was not done asking. There were still corners of the earth that remembered differently, places where the old wounds ached in the soil, where the air itself carried traces of incense and blood. In those places, your name had not faded. It had morphed into warnings, into chants, into codes passed down through families. A girl in the mountains lit a fire each winter solstice, whispering your name not as a plea, but as a ward against forgetting. Her grandmother had done the same, and her grandmother before her, not to summon you, but to remind themselves. Once there was a god who walked away. In a city swallowed by glass and steel, a boy kept a secret shrine in his closet, not of you, but of what you meant. He collected broken things, a cracked teacup, a snapped pencil, an old radio that only hummed static. Each one was labeled not with prayers, but with questions. Why must we be whole to be holy? And far beyond the reach of temples or towers, an old man carved your story into the walls of a cave, not in words, but in echoes. He would enter, speak your name, and listen as it bounced back to him again and again, smaller each time, until it was no longer sound, but memory. This, too, was a form of worship. These were the returns that mattered, not grand, not divine, but deeply, stubbornly human. The world moved on, but it did not move away, or in the tremble of a politician refusing to lie. In the silence between songs, in the touch of a nurse who whispered, "I'm here." The return came with every act that resisted spectacle, with every life lived without performance, with every truth spoken even when no one listened. That is what your people had finally learned, that divinity was not in the throne or the mask. It was in the choice to remove them. And so, in the places where your name had once ruled, peace bloomed, because the gods returned, but because they didn't need to. They had left behind something stronger than fear. They had left behind a story that asked again and again, what if we lived as though no one was watching? What if we loved as though it didn't make us sacred, but simply made us real? And that story never ended, 'cause it never had to. That was the return that never came, 'cause it never needed to. And in that, you rested, at last. So now we arrive together, you and I, at the end of this long drift through a forgotten empire, where gods once walked and men once wore their faces. You've journeyed through dusklit temples, heard the whispered prayers of a people who feared silence, and watched the weight of a false divinity hollow out a man's soul. And now, as the last echoes of that ancient world dissolve into stillness, we prepare to part ways, not with fanfare, but with a hush. By now, perhaps your breath has slowed. The room has settled into its familiar night hush. Shadows stretch like ink across the walls, and the outside world fades into a blur of quiet sounds. If you're still awake, you might feel that liminal space where thought softens and the mind drifts, freely where history and dreams intertwine. And maybe, just maybe, you can still see the God-King, not as a figure carved in obsidian or feathered in gold, but as someone very human, someone tired, someone yearning not to be believed in, but to be understood. His story was never truly about power. It was about the unbearable loneliness of being treated as more than a man. About the hunger to be touched, not with reverence, but with truth. You've seen how his every gesture echoed across cities, how every word from his lips carried the weight of prophecy even when all he really wanted was silence. You've walked beside him as the people he loved knelt before him, and you watched his heart shatter in slow motion beneath layers of ceremonial paint. Perhaps you've imagined yourself in his place, wondered how it might feel to carry the dreams of a civilization on your back, to be adored by thousands and still feel more alone than anyone ever should. And maybe you've also seen how the myth unraveled, how the lie turned on itself, how the mask fused to the man until neither could escape the other. But here, now, in this moment, there is no more mask, no more throne, no more altar, only quiet. And in that quiet, there is a different kind of truth, the kind that doesn't demand belief, the kind that gently unfolds itself in the dark and waits to be felt, not proven. So breathe. Let the remnants of empire fade into mist. Let the torches of the temples flicker out. Let the feathered cloaks and blood-red scepters fall away like leaves in the wind. You are no longer in that world. Not really. But it has left a mark, hasn't it? It's a soft one. The kind that lingers not in memory, but in feeling. And that's enough. You don't need to carry the burden of gods. You don't need to answer the questions left in the wake of myth. You only need to rest. Because in the end, that's what even the gods wanted. Not worship, just rest. So let your thoughts drift now, like the canoe on the still lake, like the incense smoke in the temple air. Let yourself fall, not into sleep, but into softness. Let the past cradle you not to hold you captive, but to sing you gently into dreams. You've done enough listening. You've wandered through time. You felt the loneliness of divinity and the relief of its release. Now it's time to let go. Not everything needs a resolution. Some stories end with silence. Some questions never needed answers. And some gods are more beautiful when they're no longer believed in. You are here. It is all that matters. You, in this moment, breathing, safe, still, and now. Let us imagine a morning after sunrise over the broken stones of a once glorious temple, dew clinging to petals once offered in sacrifice. A bird's call piercing the silence like a final note in an ancient song. No priests chant, no incense burns, but still something sacred remains. The echo of the story, the weight of the silence. In another part of the world, someone sleeps soundly, unaware that a God story has just ended in the corner of their mind. They won't remember the details, but perhaps they'll wake feeling just a little lighter, a little less afraid, a little more free. And isn't that what stories are for? Not to imprison us in awe, but to help us loosen the grip of our waking lives, to gently turn us toward dreams. You've stayed with me this long, through shadows and crowns, through doubt and remembrance. Thank you. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for letting these ancient whispers fold into the rhythm of your breath. And now, dear listener, let the world fall away. Let this last sentence not be an end, but a door, beyond it peace, softness, sleep. And when you rise again, may you walk with a little more grace. Not because you were a god, but because you dared to be one. Good night, dreamer. Rest well.